Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Mitchell. I'm a security engineer for Checkpoint in Scotland, and this afternoon we're going to discuss effectively IoT discovery automation and cybersecurity in the new age of communication. I head up IoT and OT within the pre-sales component for Checkpoint in the UK, and it's a kind of area of expansion which has gone from being a marketing buzzword to being something tangible. So we're going to cover, I'm not doing a vendor specific pitch here, I'm going to give you a framework of what we think you should be looking at and doing. And there are other vendors that do this type of work as well, but it's to give you a kind of background in this and the things to think about and areas to look at and things to consider. When I wrote the presentation, the games afoot is staying in Raby in Edinburgh is something I thought was Conan Doyle, but actually it's not. It's Henry V and by William Shakespeare. And surprisingly, it's from it's my lack of education sometimes even staggers me. It's Act 3, Scene 1, which is effectively the classic, shoot up the walls with English dead, etc. once more onto the breach. But what he does say is, I see you standing like greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start, the game's afoot. And there's a point behind this is that IoT is becoming, security of IoT and IoT itself is becoming a ubiquitous component of our background society. And we're going to cover a couple of things that we should think about and consider as individuals, but also as organizations around the deployment of IoT and how best we make it secure. On that note, I've kind of got this, I use this quite regularly, but this chap here, this Lego robot, is technically IoT. He's controlled through a phone. He gets upgrades from Lego. That is my 10-year-old son, by the way, just to make a note there. But we also have these types of devices, which are, this is, again, for my 10-year-old son, it is a magnifier for an iPhone, but it's got an OS built in it. So IoT is everywhere. It's quite ubiquitous. It's in the home. It's also more and more common out in the real world, the commercial world. And it's starting to be this idea of sensors drawing data from multiple locations. Those sensors being effectively embedded operating systems drawing down data to a central point. As some of the facts and figures here are quite interesting around basically the volume of it. The background that we don't really see it as, that an IP-enabled camera is an IoT device, a scanner is an IoT device, a home thermostat or digital thermostat's an IoT device. Your photocopier is an IoT device. But it raises a set of problems and a set of issues. Within the standard enterprise environments that we're used to, where we've got a Windows-based operating system, people are using Windows 10, there might be Windows 7 out there in the field, it doesn't really matter. This is a shift away from that kind of partial, full standards-led environment that we're using. Unix environment, there are various ways of doing that. With IoT, we have device types that are diverse. Okay, so we saw there are basically our camera magnifier, we've got our Lego robot, they all run proprietary protocols, and some are unmanaged and invisible. Technically, when this isn't attached to the phone, it's a static device, but it does have an operating system on it. And from there, that then gives us some interesting conundrums, because from a security side, there are search engines available. I'm going to show down one here, as you can see, which you can go out and find out what devices are connected directly to the internet. But also, there's a direct connection capability, because many of these devices are either connected via Wi-Fi or they're connected via a fixed infrastructure environment. So again, how do we make them secure? How do we make them easy to manage, discover, and secure? One of the big problems is that a lot of the devices are quite lightweight. So areas that we have lightweight in terms of operating systems, so they're not really designed with security in mind. They're kind of more a single solution. So going back to any of the things I've shown you, they really don't have security at the core of them. They're designed for, one's a toy, one's could be considered a toy, but it's a lightweight, photographic device. Many of them are running legacy OSs or cut down versions of OSs. So you have components of Linux, etc., that are working within this, which in some respects can be quite complex to deal with. Many have weak passwords because of the way the operating systems have to be written. And going back to, we say, our standalone device that's only allowed to speak when it's connected to a camera or a phone. So, is the problem we have is that there's a difficulty to patch these devices. So there are some inherent flaws in them. Many of the devices can be standalone. They're rarely connected to a network. They're rarely brought back into a network. Now, one of the other areas with this is it's not just the device that's at risk, and we're going to touch on this about the home setting. It's more about the network itself is at risk. If you have a device in your network that, say, is publicly accessible, the Shodan system allows you to go in and find that camera, find whatever it is, exploit that weakness. It's not just the device, it's what the device connects to. And we've seen this 2016, 2017, we started to see issues around effectively state-led actors and also non-state-led actors attacking IoT devices based on the points that we've touched on about weak OS, around weak password control, security not built in, publicly accessible. Within Checkpoint itself, recently we discovered issues with Alexa, and you can read up on this in the Checkpoint research, but effectively Alexa is an IoT device. It has control capability in your phone. It also has capability of accessing multiple parts of Amazon accounts. So internet connected device, voice enabled, it has its own inherent weaknesses. Now with this, we had contacted Amazon when this had been discovered, and they had patched this. We always work in this manner anyway. And then from there, basically that exploit was covered from June. But the point is behind it, that basically these devices are getting more and more ubiquitous. They're also getting more and more attention because it's a new frontier of cyber. It's a new way of communicating. They cross-reference into multiple systems. They cross-reference into multiple accounts. Another side was the Zigbee protocol exploit where Philips smart bulbs could be hacked. And again, this seems quite minor, but it's not, because again, it's about basically the network behind it being attacked and the delivery, the potential delivery of ransomware or spyware to networks, as it says here on the slide, but also the fact that that device is connected back into home control systems or office control systems. And from there, you then get into this interesting conundrum for home users, which are around, if you have all these smart devices, now I've shown you two, I've got a third one, which is effectively this here, which is SSE monitor. And this is OT, this is operational technology. The issue you have with this is that all of these devices are speaking into our home Wi-Fi networks. Some will be connected to your home broadband router. And with COVID, one of the areas that we have issues with is that everyone's now remote working in IT predominantly. So we're now sharing this home network environment with our corporate endpoint. So laptop, I'm a remote worker. I have a VPN service. I've got a secure endpoint system that Checkpoint supplies. But I'm sharing that with an Alexa device. I'm sharing that with smartphones. I'm sharing that with a smart TV. I'm sharing that with a gaming rig, 2 gaming rigs in my house as it is. And from there, we then have to think about, I'm accessing corporate data through that, but I'm also accessing SaaS services through that as well. So there may be corporate components that I'm accessing outside of work. We also then have, and by that I mean I've got my own Office 365 account. So all of these components are basically building up to a kind of break point for us. And one of the areas with that is that basically with the home IoT devices themselves, if they are compromised or any of these smart devices are compromised, what does that do for our basically corporate endpoint? Because we're as good in many instances as the security on the Wi-Fi network that we're getting supplied by a third party. So if we think about this model that we're now in, many people have had had to work from home. Organizations are now dependent fully on third-party broadband. That's not a corporately bought service, it's generally a privately bought service that may be expensed back, depending on where you live, depending on what your company does. So how best do we secure these endpoints? And IoT can play a factor in having to look at our home security, because this is a new perimeter, but also around how do we make sure that we're securing our home offices in a way that these devices, if they're compromised, don't then deliver security issues back to a wider organization or a wider platform. Now, going back to the Zigbee component, there are a number of case studies around building management systems being compromised, specifically through what I've just discussed. And this is why I'm taking this back to a home office environment just now during COVID. While these attacks are targeted, in 2019 we saw 2 of these around basically issues with back doors allowing buildings to be shut down remotely, or building management system to be shut down remotely. The point is behind it, those are real tangible problems out in the field. So these are things that have to be considered about how IoT is set up, where it's deployed, and basically what sensors, cameras, etc., are available to the outside world. Now, the vulnerabilities, as we're seeing here, these are figures that we've taken from the dimensional research by the Security Consolidation Survey of 2020, Forsters, as you can see there, Forrester, sorry. So what we have is effectively a number of organizations saying that they experienced a security incident related to IoT, and they feel that their current controls are not adequate. And part of that is, if you can't see it, you can't report on it. So how do we basically make that happen? Now, the checkpoint approach is, like other vendors, is to use the checkpoint component as effectively as a delivery mechanism for the security, but to use a third-party discovery engine to deliver the segmentation and classification of IoT devices. And many vendors do this because basically it's a clever and smart way of delivering the discovery capabilities. And these can be cross-linked in the back end to ensure that basically you can automatically identify a device, what type of device it is, protocol it's running, what it's speaking to, and then pass that metadata information back to Security Manager, which then can automatically write an IoT policy, which then can be pushed out to start the journey for security. Now, in our instance, we have here, generally what you should look for is something that will give you a device type, the details of the device, and then the risk score based on what the device is the device publicly available, does it need patch, does it have an inherent flaw in it? The checkpoint approach has been to work with multiple strategic partners, but also multiple other partners. So any vendor you go to, look for this and look for a partner network which will allow you to, outside of the security vendor, to either deal with each use case specific environment. So one for, say, industrial, one for healthcare, one for enterprise. In our instance here, Clarity would be an industrial one, Armis would be a checkpoint play for an enterprise one, and Medigate would be a healthcare one. But as I said, every vendor has their own way of doing this. They're very similar, but you have to get a discovery partner which is appropriate to your environment. We also have started this, and many vendors do this, which is to look at basically firmware risk assessment reports. And again, this can be done for people that are manufacturing IoT devices, but also to look at, if you have a large-scale deployment, is there a problem with the firmware across the entire environment? So again, it gives you a good idea and a good indicator very quickly of maybe what needs to be actioned around fixing potential security risks and flaws. As I said, how we do it is we take metadata back in, we bring it back into our control network, our control plane, build a specific IoT layer, and then from there, build from the metadata we've been given what can speak to what. Now, this is not the full journey here, and you may, remember, this is a baseline of what your network is from a discovery point. You may want to alter this manually, but it gives you the ability, rather than manually entering it, where you may have hundreds of different vendors or dozens of different vendors, to speeding that entire process up. You have to take into account that some vendors will have dial home functionality in their devices, those types of things. So it gives you greater control over it, but it's not the full story. You can just take the metadata that's there, put in security policies and say, this is it. But I would generally recommend that you have a look at this manually to say that once that automation point's been conducted, to kind of have a look and see, you know, is this the right layout? Because you may have something that looks like it's speaking out properly, but it actually shouldn't be speaking to the internet, for example. With the checkpoint delivery in this, our way of doing it is that, getting back to the thing about patching, is that we have application controls. So effectively we know about problems within specific builds from CVEs. So therefore we can protect these on the firewalls. And this is one way of getting around the patching. Other vendors do this, but it's a good start to basically make sure that, you know, you've got a number of controls in place to stop known exploits entering into the network. So with the automated IoT policy component is you need to profile the network, get a discovery engine, baseline it. The crowdsourcing component is effectively all the devices speaking back in. You then have the policy builder, then an automated IoT policy, which says, X to Y to Z. But as I said, irrespective of who you use for this or what you want to look at this, always cross-check that to ensure that device X is speaking back out properly. Now, this is just sort of getting into slightly more detail around patching, but given how we operate, we have a cloud-led service where threat profiles are pushed out to devices connected to it. So from that side, we allow, as I said, for the blocking of known exploits before it enters the network. And from there, basically, with that backup threat cloud, that means that can be an automated continuous process against that IoT layer. Now, this is probably for everyone that's entering into this journey, the important part. And while it says checkpoint on it, the rules I'm about to show you probably are applicable irrespective of security vendor. So the IoT component is you need an IoT discovery engine, as I said, one that's maybe suitable for suitable for the deployment you're using. So whether you're in healthcare, in an industrial setting, or an enterprise setting, make sure that the discovery engine's appropriate to that environment. You then need to look at centralized security management. Within the checkpoint model, we have an built-in IoT layer which connects to the discovery engine, which then propagates out to the security gateways. From there, you can look at any number of vendors to look at this, but that's the base model. There are also the ability to have nano agents deployed out in devices. These are kind of like endpoint protections would be for, say, a Windows PC, etc. But from that side, again, it's a case of choosing the right nano agent for the deployment. There are nano agents for industrial deployments, commercial, or medical. These 5 steps, I think, are really the kind of core to IoT, and we've got to kind of get ourselves, IoT isn't really a buzzword anymore, this is the thing. So we have to take the approach that we take with normal enterprise security. And primarily that's prevent malware from entering the network. That's number 1. The next one is about that discovery component where you can segment the devices inside the network and identify and classify the devices. Those 3 core steps basically then give you, I would say, 75% of the foundation for the next 2, which are you can then do the granular policy controls, and then you can look and identify and block malicious traffic to and from IoT devices. As I said, I've got real world experience of this where people have dial home function, and it's there for a reason. In some instances, though, it isn't required. It's on all devices. It may just be to a central point in the network. So from there, it allows you to be more intuitive in how these deployments are done. Remember, because this isn't a standard enterprise deployment in terms of, say, a Windows deployment for Windows 10, where you may have an AD and all that kind of good stuff, the issue around this is that effectively you need to know what's going on. You can only secure what you can see. So the discovery component then followed by basically cross-referencing that back to your security architecture. And you can use, in some instances, you can use current investment. In other instances, you may have to invest in additional hardware, especially in industrial control systems environments, conveyor belts, water pumping stations, those kind of things, because you may not want that traffic traversing your network all the way back to an enterprise environment. So that's the end of my rather quick presentation in this. It's kind of really, I think, the headline items to take away are the areas to consider here are in 1 to 5 are around effectively it's prevention at the edge. That's where you have to start with this. We have multiple devices potentially within a network, multiple operating systems, multiple vendors. So you've got to basically consider how do we stop malware getting to these devices. We then have to consider the segmentation of those devices within the network, whether they're on Wi-Fi or structured cabling. The identification and classification of the IoT devices then, as I said, kind of leads to that more granular policy and control, and then the identity and block malicious traffic to and from IoT devices. That's a step further, which goes back to that IoT control layer to kind of have a look in and say effectively what's going on inside the network, how best do we secure these systems and services. So if you require further information, there's obviously the checkpoint booth at the event today, and my email address is there if you've got any further information that you don't want to ask publicly within that, you can contact me and I'll come back to you. Okay. And that isn't, we're not looking, I'm not ambulance chasing here. So if you have got a general query just about, you may have other vendors in, how do we do X, whatever, I'm more than happy to have a look at that with you and maybe give you some pointers on it. Okay. So hopefully that was useful for everybody. And I will check the questions. Right. Oh, there's a lot more people than I was thinking. Okay, so the first one I have is check, right, okay, sorry. Right, so my audio was a bit in and out, I take it. Sorry about that. Calibration, background noise cancellation. Yes, I would think that would be the right bit. I get that. Zoom only, Teams, it seems to work fine. Okay, right, so fascinating. Checkpoint, is Checkpoint working in any products designed for the home office? I'm not thinking about corporate solution, but rather any security conscious, tech savvy person wanting to protect their home network, say for self-employed consultants. Now, that's an interesting one. The answer is yes, you can deploy lightweight SMB appliances that have the application control within them at home. Sorry, it's come up as private. You can, that's one question. You can, we do have products which can protect home environments. Within a Discovery Engine environment, though, what you can do is you could run the Discovery Engine because you have endpoints which are effectively going out to your corporate resource. You could theoretically run I've never done it, but you could theoretically run a Discovery Engine into a home environment if somebody wanted you to do that to see what's there. The trick here is that basically we have multiple Wi-Fi components within our home router capability, and you can theoretically break the bandwidths out and run your corporate network on one side or the other. This does not get around the fact, though, that we're running everything through a central device. And while there are security functionalities within those devices, the point is with that slide around the home environment is that effectively we do have a potential issue around home workers having corporate devices compromised remotely. And this is a kind of this is an area which we've kind of looking at quite heavily, not just in the IoT space, but just in the general cybersecurity environment. So it's a case of there are ways you could theoretically run a Discovery Engine search function out to see what IoT devices are connected back. The concern would be that it's unlikely, but somebody's hubbing all the devices of a corporate Wi-Fi component back in if you've been given a, you know, sort of 4G style device or whatever. But these are more around this is more around basically the home security itself, because this is the new perimeter. We've gone to an absolute zero-day trust model in the space of March in the UK and most other places as well. Ewan Ross had asked, do the aggregation points for LoRa or Zigbee not provide a layer of protection? Yes, they do. They do now. The problem with this, that I can put a link up, but the problem is with this that it was the bulb itself, it was the communication layer in the bulb and the way in which it had been written could be compromised. And that then could be fed back out. It was a very specific use case, but I can put the information up in that actually in the chat window. So the dark side of smart lighting. There we go. So right, so that's the case study for the smart lighting there. And sorry, I've been asked, sorry, I was just putting some stuff in. So are there any more questions? Sorry, it's oh, right. EBD to everyone, sir. Can you please elaborate on the difference between AI experts, ML engineers, and data science robotics, and which one is best? I have no idea on that one. That's quite quite a large question actually, so I need to have a think and get back to you on that, I'm afraid. Is there any other, sorry, are there any other questions, or will I bring the session, just staying to time roughly, will I bring the session to an end? I'm taking out, right, okay. Right, so Ross Kelly's question, do you believe some businesses, organisations aren't taking IoT security risks seriously enough? Well, I think, Ross, the area with this is that effectively no one's really taking it as seriously as they should. And the problem is it's ubiquity, it's newness and ubiquity. The concept IoT has been with us for a long time. There have been IP-enabled cameras for a long, long time out in the field. But the problem we now have is we're going into a sensor-led world. Tech's kind of caught up with the vision. So narrowband, narrowband technology for lots of small devices speaking back. I think that the problem we have is that we're also greying an area here between operational technology and IoT. I see them as two very different things. The other one is that operational technology is obviously power systems, construction, those types of things. Whereas the IoT environment blends into that. It goes from my house with a Lego robot and camera amplifier through to basically IP-enabled networks, sensor arrays in cities, etc. And it's that ubiquity and that kind of wide-ranging component that's I think is why people aren't taking it seriously. It does need to be addressed because because of how many systems are deployed that I've seen, they do cross into multiple areas. So it does need to be addressed and looked at. And I think one of the problems is it's a case of it's at a manufacturing level. That'll catch up eventually. We see this with adoption of new tech. But also I think, an approach level, going back to those 5 points I'd laid out, that people need to take it as seriously as they would their enterprise security. So I'll draw everything to a close there. Thank you very much for listening to me. Sorry the audio maybe was in and out for some people. But if anyone's got any questions, it's markmi@checkpoint.com. And as I said, if you want to drop by the booth, Paul and myself are there, okay? So thank you. Thanks, Ross.